Good evening, everyone. My name is Julie Solomon. Welcome to Holy Blossom Temple and another event in our series of expert talks brought to you by the committee of the Luke Sklar Mental Health Initiative. This initiative was established in 2018 by a group of volunteers whose aim was to provide education, support, and resources related to the challenges of living with or supporting someone with mental illness. Over the years, our congregants and the community have benefited from live and virtual talks from professionals and lived experience guests on topics including depression, suicide, resilience, addiction, and anxiety, to name a few. Our aim is to contribute to ending the stigma around mental illness and encourage those who need it to seek help. This evening's event is sponsored by the Luke Sklar Mental Health Initiative. The talk will be recorded to allow those who are interested to view this at a later date. When someone speaks of ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it often brings to mind images of overactive children, often boys, blurting out, disruptive in the classroom, disorganized, forgetful, can't get their homework started, daydreaming, just to name a few descriptors. In fact, about 5% of adults in Canada have ADHD. It manifests itself in ways that most adults don't recognize, but constantly struggle with: underachievement in school or jobs, difficulty getting down to a project or finishing it, relationship breakdown, scrambling to care for children or spouses, forgetting dates and deadlines, and difficulty holding down a job. Some adults live their entire lives with undiagnosed and untreated ADHD. How do you know you have it? Maybe your child's just been diagnosed with ADHD and you think, oh, maybe I have the same behaviors. Maybe a spouse or friend has gently suggested consulting a specialist due to chronic troubles. Many adults are reluctant to pursue a diagnosis due to the stigma of having a psychiatric disorder, or that they've spent years using strategies to mask or manage their issues and don't need help at this stage of life. Dr. Brian Goldman remarked on a CBC radio show that many use the term ADHD jokingly, or they trivialize it, but its impact is serious. Our aim this evening is to help you recognize if you have ADHD, what is ADHD and what drives it, how to formally diagnose it, its relationship to other mental health disorders, and what are today's best treatment options. This evening, we're very pleased to have Dr. Daron Almagor as our expert speaker on ADHD in adults. We invite our live stream guests to post questions for Dr. Almagor at any time in the chat box, and we will do our best to raise them anonymously during the Q&A portion. Before we invite Dr. Almagor to speak, we would like to welcome Rabbi Eliza McCarroll to provide us with a Jewish lens on this evening's topic.
Thank you.
Here.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Julie. And I'm looking forward to learning with all of you this evening. I'm, as Julie said, Rabbi Eliza McCarroll. So there's a text that comes from our Midrash Breshit Rabbah, so a collection of rabbinic stories and tales about the book of Genesis. And to lift up, it's the very first piece. And it just starts, Rabbi Hoshaya Rabbah Patach, and quotes from the book of Proverbs, Ve'ehyeh etzlo amon, ve'ehyeh sha'ashuim yom yom. That's all the Hebrew I'll bring us. So Rabbi Hoshaya the Great begins, the speaker is wisdom. The Torah personified was with God as an amon, a delight day after day. So for a second to concentrate on this word amon, what the Midrash will go on to talk about is this many interpretations or translations of this word. Amon means a child's caretaker. Amon means to be covered or hidden. Some say it means greatness. And amon, eventually the rabbis get to, also means an artisan. The Torah is then saying, according to the Midrash, I was the tool of craft of the Holy One, blessed be God. And it talks about the way that the world is then built through this lens is that no one builds a palace based on their own knowledge, but on the knowledge of the artisan. The artisan does not then build a palace based on their knowledge, but rather on the plans and the sheets and the tables by which they have ascertained how many rooms, how many doors, etc. So too, the Holy One, blessed be God, looked into the Torah and created the world. As the Torah says, Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, Bereshit, God created. And this word Reshit refers to Torah. So what I really love about this text is that it feels like this analogy, all these different versions of the word Amon feel like different ways of viewing or constructing the world and all different ways of being in all of their beauty, in all of their potential, in all of their possibility, and some of which I know we'll be discussing and learning about this evening. And ultimately, it also suggests that in the end, we are all created in the divine image from this divine blueprint, with the Torah being that blueprint, envisioned just exactly the way we are from the very beginning. There's then a lot of great comfort and hope in that idea, and so I'm looking forward to seeing the world from a new perspective and learning to support those who do through the insights of Dr. Almagor this evening. Thank you for being here, and thanks to everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi, for your insightful message that bridges Jewish customs and laws to helping us find meaning and order in our own day-to-day lives. Doreen?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Doreen Saskin, and I'm a proud and long-standing member of the Luke Sklar Mental Health Initiative. It's my pleasure to introduce the renowned Dr. Doron Almagor, someone who truly understands the challenges of ADHD. Dr. Almagor is a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist who completed his specialty training in psychiatry at the U of T. He's an expert in the diagnosis and treatment of ADHD and disorders like anxiety and depression that often accompany it. He is the chair of CADRA's Advisory Council, which provides healthcare professionals across Canada with scientifically supported guidelines for diagnosing and treating ADHD. He has also served as the president of the Ontario Psychiatric Association. Dr. Almagor lectures internationally and trains medical residents at the University of Toronto in the diagnosis and treatment of ADHD. He is also the founder and director of Possibilities Clinic, headquartered here in Toronto. This clinic serves children, teens, and adults across Ontario with in-person and telemedicine assessments and treatments. So now let me get out of the way so that we can welcome him to the stage right now and learn about this misunderstood condition, adult ADHD. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't think I've ever had such a great introduction from like a rabbi and two people, and that's really terrific. Thank you. So I love talking about ADHD. As you've heard, I was the chair of CADRA, and I'm the chair of the Advisory Council at CADRA. So it's a topic I talk a lot about, and I love talking to community members, and I see many of you here could be professionals. You might be affected by ADHD, have family affected by ADHD, or just want to know more about ADHD and other mental health issues. And I think that's all worthwhile. And I'll give a kind of roundabout talk about ADHD, and then we can I love to take questions and actually really get to what's on your mind and talk about that. That's my favorite part, so we'll get to that. And I'm going to just open up. I'm going to frame my talk around myths that won't go away and misconceptions, and that ties into stigma. Oh, is there a little louder? Great. So I can, okay. So I don't want to, okay, great. Is that better? Okay. And so I think the misconceptions tie in to a lot of stigma as well. And I think as we have fewer misconceptions, we'll have less stigma and we'll have less kind of bad treatments that go on, more hope for people. And you'll see that ADHD has real negative effects on people. And I'll touch on that. And we have solutions for that. People needn't suffer for ADHD with ADHD, and if we can kind of get rid of some of these myths. I'm not going to show this now if we have time. So how do these myths evolve? And I've been trying to think over time, why do we have so much stigma, so many myths around ADHD? And we have them about mental health issues in general, but for whatever reason, ADHD in particular is one that is like lightning bolt. It's a lightning bolt for the anti-psychiatry movement, as I'll show, and also just a lot of these ideas that won't go away. Unfortunately, what you're seeing here is some very popular type of articles and books that are not helping that. So I really would encourage you all to, just because something is a Globe and Mail bestseller, I think that's what it says here, an international bestseller, doesn't mean it's giving good facts. It's giving a story, and stories are very attractive. We see that every day. People love stories. You can convince people with stories, but it's not what the science shows. And science has faults, but it's trying to find the right answers. And if it's wrong, it has a self-correcting mechanism to it. Stories and myths don't have that. Newspapers have really kind of been hysterical about ADHD at times. Toronto Star, New York Times especially. Not so much in the recent past. It's been better. For a while, there was just article after article about how bad ADHD medications are, how ADHD is being overdiagnosed, whether or not it's a real type of issue. That used to come up a lot. Less so now, but I still think it's there. And questions like, is ADHD a disorder? Is it naughty? ADHD Nation, is it even real? Is it all caused by pharma? Is it, what is going on? It's a question. I do think the fact that children are involved, and even though we're talking about adult ADHD, we can't separate the two out. This started off as a, quote, children's type of, quote, disorder, and it's kind of in the mind, it's there as such. So it's not going to be separated as that. And people, when they think about ADHD, they think about medicating children, even though it's not just about children, and it's not just about medicating either. So, but those are caught up in that. So this is Gabor Mate. This is the author of Scattered Minds. And I just brought him up because he's on the news a lot, and he has a story about ADHD, which is false. It's all about ADHD not being genetic, being caused by parenting, his theory about how to deal with ADHD. I mean, there's some, obviously with anything like this, there's some good points to it, but it's a false narrative. And I think false narratives have a function. They simplify reality with a story. So they make complex things kind of manageable. They scapegoat so they can find an external enemy. They provide membership in a very virtuous group. So people that have his book, have read it, will say, well, I know the truth about ADHD. This is about big pharma, it's doctors and so forth. I'm better than that, so I know what's going on. It fearmongers. And I guess the problem with all that is my final point, that in the end it hurts because it doesn't provide solutions that corroborate true reality. So it might make people feel virtuous, but it's not actually, in my experience, And I've treated, the clinic is for more than 30,000 people. I've treated more than 10,000 people myself with ADHD. So it's from my sample, from my reading of the research, it doesn't corroborate to reality. Okay, so these are some of the myths. ADHD is caused by bad parenting, social media, and pharmaceutical industry. Those are some of the myths that we see. And I want to talk about facts today that actually give people hope and things we can talk about. So we know that ADHD is actually neurobiological disorder. There's more scientific literature on ADHD than any other psychiatric disorder. And that is more than depression, more than schizophrenia, more than anxiety, everything else. We have more proof, quote, so to speak, more correlations with brain structures and ADHD than we have with any other type of psychiatric issue. I wouldn't say we exactly know what it is in ADHD is going on. So these are all brain kind of areas that are implicated in ADHD. And I'm not going to get into heavy science today, but it's not like a one area that's doing it all. And it's a very, very heterogeneous type of condition. You've seen one person with ADHD, you've seen one person with ADHD. Everybody with ADHD looks different, they present differently, which makes it more challenging to identify, to treat, but that's the way it is. There's one part there, and I don't know if I'm going to try it. Oops, sorry. I'm going to, right here. This is probably where a lot of the ADHD kind of symptoms come from. And the way I explain it to people is your brain is wired fine. There's nothing wrong with your brain, but there might be some dysregulation in your dopamine levels in the brain. And dopamine is a brain chemical. So it's a neurotransmitter which helps the brain, which causes the brain to function, moves the neurons, or kind of have an electrical signal, but they don't, it's not electricity, it's through chemicals called neurotransmitters. So dopamine and noradrenaline, which is kind of like a dopamine substance, is the kind of chemical that is most associated with ADHD. And it is the neurotransmitter that ADHD medications affect. And it seems to be that most of the studies we have show that dopamine levels seem to be low in the prefrontal cortex in ADHD. So the prefrontal cortex, that's the kind of most advanced part of people's brains. And that's the part that helps us kind of orchestrate things. So it tells us where to focus, when to calm down, what to do next, how to sequence activities. You can think of it as a conductor of an orchestra. And that's the problem in ADHD. Now you might think is, how come in ADHD, if it's underactive, you have underactive levels of kind of the prefrontal cortex and dopamine, why are some people, not everybody with ADHD, only some people with ADHD are hyperactive? It's because that part of the brain helps people calm down. So it kind of tells people that part of the brain kind of directs you to focus and slow down, calm down. So you can almost think of it as if you have power steering in your car, which most cars do, that isn't working. So you're hyperactive. Your car, you can't steer it in the right direction. So one analogy you could make. Now this is heritability index. So whatever you hear about ADHD being kind of caused by bad parenting, none of the science says that. I mean, good parenting helps in ADHD. To manage ADHD, parenting support is one of the things that really helps kids with ADHD, is actually teaching parents how to manage ADHD symptoms in a way that doesn't stigmatize a child. But it is very highly heritable. So these are just a whole bunch of studies for ADHD. And the magic number here is they all kind of average out to about 0.7. And all that means 0.7 is a high heritability index. And to give you a kind of like an example, height, for instance, is about the same level. So you could think of it, it's as heritable as height, for instance. So it's not 100%, but it's very highly heritable. So, as I put it here, it's almost all in the family. I think, Julie, you mentioned something about maybe your child has ADHD, and then maybe you have one. If your child has ADHD, or if a child in the family has ADHD, then there's a 50% chance a parent has ADHD. And that's, I'm a child psychiatrist originally. I didn't really initially start seeing adults with ADHD. Over the years, there were no doctors in Toronto that would treat adult ADHD. That's kind of how I started. And so what would typically happen is, and I'll get more into the history of adult ADHD, is that I would see a mom or a dad, and they would talk about their child with ADHD, and they would start talking, you know what, this is just like I was at that age. And then things would begin to click. So that's actually how I got into the field, and by talking to colleagues in the field that were also seeing more and more of this, although they had kind of seen it earlier and were publishing on it. So it's very, very common. So this is just one illustration of the genetics. And so often when we treat a family, we're treating one or two parents, half the kids. And I also find that a lot of people with ADHD, there is some mating with other people with ADHD. So you often find that as well. So it might be even higher than this because of that. So this is a simple definition of ADHD, and I hate the name ADHD. It's a bad wording of what it is. It's not a deficit. It's a self-regulation. It's dysregulation of focus and attention, and maybe hyperactivity. People with ADHD can focus very well at times. They can hyperfocus, but when they hyperfocus, they could be playing video games and hyperfocusing. The fire alarm could go off. They may not hear it. So it's a very extreme focus, or they can get extremely unfocused. So they tend to be all over the place. So I would call it a dysregulation disorder. So executive functioning, it's maybe like a fancy way of saying getting things done. And to get things done, there's a lot of little functions that go in there. So if, let's say, you're a high school student who has to write an essay, you have to, one executive functioning is impulse control. Like you can't text your girlfriend, and you can't go online, can't play video games, and then you got to get all the materials in order, and you've got to put some time aside, and you got to tune out your brother in the next room, and you got to make sure you ate before, and so there's a lot of little steps that go in that. In ADHD, we see this regulation of all those functions, and that's what happens. And people can be very uneven, so sometimes it can really mystify people. Like, how come, she can focus so well on something she's interested in, and she can't focus on something else at all? It tends to be that level of extreme, and it doesn't tend to be a lot of ability to focus on things you're not really obsessed or interested or really passionate about. And we all have to be focused on things we don't want to do a lot of the time, right? Like we've got to do like our taxes or something we don't want to do, right? Things you can relate to that nobody really focuses well on, but you kind of have to kind of get the executive functioning in place. So here's another myth. ADHD is a childhood condition only. And I think this is not when I started on the field, this was much more present. And this is an article you can see right here. Hyperactive children often suffer as adults. This is the first article in major paper based on one of the first research papers. It was actually Canadian scientists, psychiatrists that had, quote, discovered adult ADHD. This is 1979. You can see computers become major design tool. So this is like little pixels and stuff. It's quite, and who knew there was benefits to mother's milk? I guess it's 1979. And is this okay, or is it, am I still okay? Thanks. Yeah, I tend to walk away from, and kind of move around a bit. Thanks. And so you can see that that's there. So Lily Heckman and Gabriel Weiss from Montreal, they were the ones who discovered this. And I actually, through my own clinical experience, the one I spoke about with kids and also meeting them at conferences, is how I kind of started really kind of getting it. But it was only in the year 2000 that I kind of really, like late 90s is really when I was kind of really beginning to kind of get it. And I would say most Canadian psychiatrists, probably still not, but really only 2010s, 2015, something like that. So even though something might be published in 1979, and might have been sitting there all along, like what other thing do we say magically goes away at age 18, right? This was the big headline that somehow people that had, and at this point they called them hyperactive kids, they weren't really attuned either to kids that only had inattention. It didn't seem hyperactive at all. But what else would we say disappears at age 18? But at that point in time, the people just didn't see it. They just, because they weren't looking for it, they just assumed it just disappeared at 18. So I think our human cognition is not that good, and we don't see things that we're not looking for. And I've had a similar experience happen to me again with autism. And I did not see a lot of cases of autism. So even I was seeing this in the, let's say, early 2000s, 2010s. I've missed, so now we're recognizing more and more comorbid, which is another kind of medical way of saying co-occurring autism, which goes with ADHD a lot. Like there's quite a lot of correlation between autism and ADHD. Some people even hypothesize that autism is like an extreme form of ADHD. But that aside, it's very common to have the two together, but people weren't really thinking about it, so they weren't seeing it. Now that I'm looking for it, you see it all the time. So this was the kind of seminal research article that came up. And how many kids persist? So that's been an ongoing question. So do any kids do any kids grow out of it? And that's, people often say they'll grow out of it. I hear that a lot. Like I used to hear that more when people didn't want treatment. Let's just stop, she'll grow out of it. So very few people grow out of it. It's not a common thing. There might be a subset of people with ADHD. The brain does mature till about age 25, 30. And in some, there might be a subset of ADHD. I mean, let's face it, we don't know everything I'm talking about today. 20 years from now, I hope we have different words for ADHD, and we have 10 different types that are more correlated to brain function and so forth. Like it's not, our science isn't where it should be, but there might be some people where ADHD seems to resolve and they don't seem to have it. And their ADHD might have been function of what we call a kind of delayed brain maturation. They're probably less than 10, 20% of kids. The rest, there's maybe another subset where the brain isn't changing, but they learn to cope. Maybe they've had a lot of ADHD coaching, which is like a cognitive behavioral therapy for ADHD, which teaches people techniques. They use a lot of strategies, external strategies, like finding things like tools they can find outside of themselves to help, and also mind strategies, or they have very supportive spouses, they have an assistant at work. Maybe they found a way to manage it. So they don't meet the formal criteria for ADHD, but their brain is still ADHD. Like take away those things and their brain is still ADHD. So what's interesting is most recently, some of the recent research, and I'm showing you something here, is that the blue one is after you get diagnosed, a fluctuating status. A lot of people fall into this fluctuating status. More people, because the way we've built a diagnosis system, we say people that have ADHD have it or they don't have it. It's kind of black and white. And that's kind of true, but not exactly, because a lot of people, like, they like I said, if they're in the right situation, they might be able to cope with their ADHD, and then they don't have the formal diagnoses. So, but if something happens, they have another child, their job puts more stress on them, that kind of tips them over into the formal diagnoses, right? So, because the formal diagnoses are often based in these research studies, they're not based on a kind of a brain finding of having ADHD or not. They're based on symptom counts, and the symptom counts are a way of trying to measure ADHD, but they're not 100% accurate, as you can imagine. Like, if you make 5 symptoms, you have it, 6 you don't. You have to take that, look at that with a bit of, not cynicism isn't the right word, but you gotta think about that. So that's why for the diagnoses, it's really not just a simple symptom count. Like, you'll see an online survey, do or do you not have ADHD? And if you fill it out, you have 6 symptoms out of 9, you have ADHD. That's not the way it really works. That's part of it. That's a way to measure symptoms. Those are good tracking kind of systems, so you can kind of track response to treatment that way to see if you have less symptoms. They're good screening kind of devices, so if you score on those are good ways to say, maybe it's something I should look at. But in and themselves, it's not that simple to make it a simple symptom count, and a good clinician is going to look at more than that. So, are ADHD rates increasing? So, I used to put this slide on and then I changed this slide, or not exactly this slide, but I would say myth, ADHD rates are not increasing. I don't know anymore. So I don't think so. I think recognition is increasing, but I can't say for sure. So this is what you see here. It's a scatter curve. So you see this is the percentage of people with ADHD. And so when you see a study, if you see a headline study saying 20% of people on this study have ADHD, take that with a grain of salt, because you'll see the next study will say 1% of people have ADHD. Studies have errors. So that's why you want to take the average of a lot of studies, put them together. So this is what this did. It took an average, all the studies together. So each dot there is one study showing the percentage of people with ADHD, and that line across is the average. And you can see the line across is pretty steady, and the rates of ADHD about 6% in kids, maybe 4 or 5% in adults, right? So like most adults, I say, but most kids, adults still have ADHD. That maybe you've got 20% or so that don't seem to, and that's been very steady over the years. But I think the change happened around the pandemic. And so you can see at around 2019, what do you see? There's a rise. And this is just one study. I've seen other ones too that show an uptick in ADHD. And why is that? Now, a lot of adults with ADHD during especially we're kind of forgetting now, the height of the pandemic, we were stuck at home. And a lot of people with ADHD depended on what I would call external scaffolding. So that means that a lot of what they were doing was organized by the environment around them. So if they were at work, their boss was there or somebody was there, there were cues there. Okay, now is the time for that meeting. You're going to do that meeting. You're going to do, Brenda, you've got to do this report in an hour. So everything was right there with them, and they were getting stimulated and so forth. Now they were at home. The dog, the kids, the fridge, all those things, making it much harder for somebody with ADHD to self-regulate, right? That's what they need to do. They'll self-regulate. Like scaffolding, just going to give you an example. Scaffolding, I see a lot of teens that fall apart at about like age 18, 19. What happens? They go to university, they're alone, Some of them will have moms, I should say moms and dads, who will take them every morning, pick them up, wake them up, give them their meds, drag them to school, drop them in, pick them up, like to do everything. They don't quite ever like detached in a way because they have ADHD and they feel they can't, but whatever, won't get into that. But then they go to university, they got to do it on their own. Teachers there don't care, they don't know you. There's none of this scaffolding. You got to be organized. There's drugs in the dorm, whatever. And so half, they come back half during. What usually happens is halfway through the year, they call parents and say, I'm failing everything. Parents had no idea, or it's the end of the year, and it's too late, and so forth. So it's good to get before they do that if you're seeing a lot of scaffolding. But anyway, I got kind of, and it's another favorite kind of problem that we resolve, that I work on. But this issue here, I don't know what it is. I could say it might just be a fact that people are under more stress. That's the only reason. The other potential thing is that there might be some overdiagnoses going on. I have seen it. I can't say I haven't. There are some places or people that are just too ready to just say, okay, it's ADHD, are using that checklist approach. You've got 6 symptoms. Okay, here are the meds. And so there is that part. So I don't like that part because I think it stigmatizes ADHD and then prevents people that really need medications or treatment, other treatments, from getting treatment. But I think it's worthwhile then extending the need for accurate diagnoses before doing anything. That it's not just you feel like you have ADHD, you have it. And so, because there has been a bit of social contagion over TikTok and stuff of people self-identifying and then demanding treatment and getting that. So a good assessment is still needed at all times. And I think we're seeing that by the numbers. Some of the numbers could also show better recognition too. So I just don't know. So another one, ADHD is fun and harmless. And you mentioned that. It's still there. People make jokes about ADHD. It's my ADHD, all that. And people make a joke like that. They usually don't have ADHD. So this is what ADHD causes. And you can start seeing ADHD in toddlers. So often when you get moms to talk about their different kids, they'll be able to identify their ADHD kid in retrospect, that they were harder to calm, more colicky, more behavioral dysregulation, had harder time getting to sleep cycle and so forth. But not a big deal. Then you get to kids with ADHD and you start seeing more problems in school, maybe some self-esteem issues because they're having trouble with peers, right? They can't really regulate themselves in the playground. They may get impulsive with games, or they're not focusing on conversations and groups. So there may be, kids can be mean and they become outcasts. But still, it's manageable and it's not a problem. But then you get into teens where you can get into risky stuff and you get to substance use. And I don't think I'll get into it, but the ADHD brain is hungry for dopamine. It's looking for something, and kids will often find a solution. And cannabis seems to be the common solution because the brain might be going 100 miles an hour, or their inattention is making them anxious. They take it, and everything is calm for the first time in their lives, and they just feel great. And they think it's a cure. They think it's helping them. It's not helping them because inside they feel good, but it doesn't help their executive functioning, which is about getting things done. So what they're actually producing is not great. And it also affects working memory, which is a big issue with ADHD. So it just puts fire on fire. But they feel good about it. It might even get them a social group, right? Like so it could get them into the in-group, all kinds of things. And then But often still, the consequences of your teen are still limited. You're still protected by society. But then you get to college and then you start failing. Then you get into all kinds of trouble and you start seeing injury, you start seeing more car accidents. I'm not getting into that today. You know what? I don't think I included in this. I completely forgot to include slides on death rates. Did I include them or not? I'm not sure. But death rates are higher in ADHD. Surprisingly, they're actually higher in women with ADHD. We think because they're untreated. And a lot of the death rates come from accidents, substance use and accidents. So ADHD takes 14 years of someone's lifetime. That's one way of kind of visualizing the effect it has. So again, not fun and games. And so you can see I did include death, but it is, well, I did put fatal, I see. Injury, accidents, divorce, depression, substance use, very serious effects. So that's what happens with untreated ADHD. And some of that actually, see, this is actually new data. A lot of this data about increased death rates, accidents, is only about 5, 10 years old. Before that, the experts in the field didn't know about that, right? It's not that was not that obvious to us, and wasn't obvious to us. If you were to ask me who would be more likely, would it be men or women to have higher death rates? I would say intuitively, I would say, oh, men for sure, right? But it's actually women. So intuition is not always correct when we look at the science. Again, I think it's because women tend to be underdiagnosed and undertreated. So decreased educational achievement, we definitely see that. Decreased employment performance, divorce, isolation. Other psychiatric issues come up, disease, accident rates, and early death come up. So all those things do come up. I did have death in here, just not my actual death slide. So, okay. Easy to diagnose. So it's not super hard. It's not impossible, but it's not, like I said, it's not checklist. And some of the factors in that is some of what I've showed you already, is that kind of variability that goes on and the way people can cope and mask ADHD, that you don't always see the symptoms. They've learned to find ways to cope with it. The other part is when we think about ADHD, or we still think about, I think you mentioned the little kid that's running around, the kind of Bart Simpson stereotype. And that kid is easier to diagnose because you see it. It's right there. And the teacher will say to the parent, take your kid to a doctor because he's disrupting the class. Like the teacher will see it. So that's the guy on the right? He might have been the hyperactive kid. Now he's juggling 100 things. He has maybe some speeding tickets on his Porsche, stuff like that, but he's not running around the playground anymore. But so he's kind of easy to recognize. He's talking fast. He's on the phone making sales, whatever. That's a stereotype. I shouldn't be doing that. But that's what it might look like in an adult. But the dreamy girl, and again, I'm not saying that all girls are the inattentive type and all boys are hyperactive. It's a tendency. You can definitely see inattentive boys and hyperactive girls, but it does seem to kind of trend that way, that a lot of the girls with ADHD may only be inattentive. And a lot of the girls with ADHD may want to please more. They may be trying harder. So they'll be maybe sitting in the classroom, not paying attention, just kind of looking straight ahead, kind of making like they're paying attention. They might be bright and just able to cope okay until a particular age, or they might be going home and then catching up later at home and burning the midnight oil, so putting extra stress on themselves. The teachers don't know. Teachers say they do fine because all they see is you're sitting there and maybe they've just learned to just look attentive. But it puts stress on them. They get anxious, they get depressed, they still have all the higher accident rates, they may turn to substances, all that type of stuff. So it has a large effect on that, and it's under-recognized. Definitely getting more recognized than before, but still there. And this, I do lectures on other subtopics around this because there's issues around menopause and ADHD, hormonal cycles and ADHD, all kinds of interesting aspects to that. But we're not getting into that today, but it's definitely getting more research and attention these days, which is great. But still under-recognized. So what goes into the diagnosis of adult ADHD? So symptoms of inattention and hyperactivity. So it can be and or. Very few people are just hyperactive without inattention. So usually you have either the inattentive kind of present, we call it a presentation, or the hyperactive and inattentive presentation, and maybe a small amount with just hyperactivity. But it's not just a checklist. It's somebody sitting with you and understanding what those symptoms are, how they present, in which context, is it school, is it work, what the actual functional level of that is, what do you mean by that, how does it track across your life. It's a whole bunch of things. It's not just one. That symptom checklist that you see online, that's just a way to get started. So we call that we really want to get a nerd-of-mouth interview and how that fits into everything else, not just, you can't look at those symptoms in isolation, right? Like how you did overall in school, your cognitive level, your other psychiatric, everything together, like your whole development, whether there were any kind of issues in walking and talking, all that type of stuff. So the timeline, and it needs to persist. And as you've seen, you again got to take that persistence. It should persist overall because it is a neurobiological difference. That's why we like to phrase it, that people with ADHD are kind of wired differently. So if they're wired differently, you're going to see it in childhood and you're going to continue seeing it. And it can go up and down, but you should see signs of it throughout. We should try to get some objective, not just subjective feelings. I don't always find people's subjective reporting all that accurate. Teens don't report accurately at all. Like they may not be focusing at all, and they'll say, oh, no, I focus great. But everybody sees that they're focusing for 1 minute and then they're off to something else. It's just as objective as we can get. But they don't actually, that self-observation of focus isn't something that develops actually till about in adulthood, till about age 25, really being able to reflect what is going on in yourself. So teens and kids are not able to do that. So their own report of whether or not they can focus is not accurate. And also, if you have ADHD and that's normal for you, how do you know you're not focused well, right? You don't always know. This is you. This is who you are. So you may not really recognize how it goes. When I couldn't see anything, like when I was about 13, I needed glasses. And it was kind of by accident that someone noticed I couldn't see the blackboard and something. And then I put on glasses and I realized, wait, my vision was completely off and must have been for a year or two. But I guess because it was just changing slowly, I had no idea that I wasn't seeing properly. So, and I think that can go on for all of us when you see what's going on for you. So we try to get report cards for adults, get old report cards. Sometimes it's hard with adults, depending on their age. Those report cards may have different standards and so forth. We will sometimes get parental reports, like get parents involved, even if they're adults, if people are open to that. And also try to get spouses, other people like coworkers, things like that. The other part you got to do is look at, again, the fancy word of saying things that co-occur with ADHD that can either be mental health issues or physical issues that can either add to ADHD, look like ADHD, or be together with ADHD. So, for instance, if you're depressed, it's very hard to focus, or people are depressed to focus, to be in, to get things done, to be able to maintain attention. So they can have some common symptoms that can go between them. So you have to differentiate: is this part of a depression? Is it part of ADHD? Or maybe both. A lot of people with ADHD get depressed because they've gotten divorced. They've had many issues. So you got to go that for a lot of things, and again, it gets very complicated. There's a lot of different type of issues that can look like ADHD and may or may not be. And there's also physical issues like thyroid disorders, seizures, things like that. Typically, they tend to be easier to rule out, but I've definitely seen issues where people come to the clinic and but the doctor never took their thyroid or something like that. We take it and it's way off and it's not ADHD. And I did talk a bit about this as we went along. So why sometimes when we see people, to have the formal diagnoses, you're supposed to have evidence of childhood symptoms. But we don't always have very clear evidence of childhood symptoms. You gotta infer things sometimes. And like I said, sometimes in the past, it just wasn't on people's radar. They weren't thinking about it. Like we've had people who are 70, like, so I've seen lots of people where their school never even knew about ADHD. So the inattentive symptoms, as I said, are often they're silent. People don't see that. There might have been a lot of environmental scaffolding. So, parents, work, spouses help, and then you don't see it because everything is being supported. Some people with ADHD, a lot of people with ADHD are very bright, and it's a neurodevelopmental difference. So you see a lot of people with ADHD that might be gifted, and they're amazing. They can do things. So they compensate with their giftedness and high IQ, and you wouldn't know about the ADHD because how could they have ADHD? They have straight A's, right? That's what everybody is thinking. They have a PhD or they're successful lawyers, whatever it is. Sometimes this is more around with women. Sometimes they have like maybe borderline ADHD. It's there, they're coping, but then menopause unmasks a lot of it. So hormonal changes can unmask ADHD. And again, you kind of and maybe they can't or maybe they just can't compensate as much. They're just getting older. You have some cognitive changes. You can't do as much. There is some question of there's some people maybe even develop ADHD when they're adults. We don't fully understand this. It's a hot topic of debate in when I go to conferences, people will get very vociferous about this. So I don't know if this is true or not. I think more research is needed. So that's another question. The other thing about ADHD is a good assessment doesn't stop with ADHD, right? It's like if you treat ADHD and you have high levels of anxiety, you're still not going to get well, right? The wheel is still going to be broken, right? So things are only going to be as good once everything is attended to. So you got to look at things that go along with ADHD. Autism is very big. Another missed one is learning disabilities. Half of adults with ADHD, up to half adults, may have a learning disability as well. And a learning disability doesn't mean somebody has a lower IQ or is, quote, dumb or something like that. It means their brain processes information differently, which can make learning particular things like, you probably all have heard of dyslexia, which would be a particular type of learning disability in reading, where the brain's processing networks for reading are different and make it difficult to read, and there's ways around that. So up to 50% of people with ADHD have a learning disorder. For kids, I think it's really important to look for that and address it because there are treatments for many of them and accommodations. For adults, it may not be, good, might be good to know. People often like to know and they say, oh, that's what happened. That's for their own knowledge. But for to do something about that, it may not be as like there may not be like an actual thing to do at that point in time unless you're in school. If university students would still, I would suggest they look at that. Tourette syndrome, very common, under kind of diagnosed, undertreated. People just don't see it. I've seen lots of people with tics, and you kind of go, your eye kind of goes, and then they say, no, it doesn't do that. And they just, again, it's their normal. They don't know, but it's very common. Depression, anxiety, substance is often secondary to ADHD. So often we treat ADHD. We can get to that. And physical things, sleep, really important to look at. A lot of people with ADHD have sleep issues, so sleep disorders that have to be addressed, or they have bad sleep habits, which make ADHD worse. There's a whole kind of sleep cycles. Maybe they may have a later onset sleep cycle. That's common in ADHD, so there's ways to address that. So ADHD treatment is controversial. And that's another funny thing that people argue about ADHD treatment. We have so much science around what works for ADHD, both medically and non-medically. So we know what works in terms of medications, and we also know what types of psychotherapies work for ADHD. And we also know what doesn't work. This is just a paper, I was part of it, where we came up like consensus statements, alternative evidence-based conclusions. So yeah, it might be it's online for free. If you take that photo, you can download it. It's open source journal, open access journal, so you can get that. So it is a nice way of just putting down 208 facts we thought were just the best evidence-based conclusions about ADHD, and in little snippets like this, so it's very readable. So like, the first one was about students, about how it helped increase their grades and so forth, increasing substance use rates, all kinds of things like that. So if you wanted to get that article, if you just Google the name, you could find it online. So we have I'm trying to say lots of evidence about what works in ADHD. And a lot of what works in ADHD, probably like the strongest treatment we have, it doesn't work for everybody. It works for about 70, 80% of people. Some people find that they just don't do well on medications, but the treatment with the strongest effects, one of the pillars of ADHD treatment is medications. And I mentioned dopamine being one of the kind of neurotransmitters that's implicated in ADHD. And these medications are basically all doing the same thing. They're trying to upregulate your dopamine levels. And you're trying to retune the dopamine levels in the ADHD brain to a more optimal level. And it's kind of like I describe it to people. Some of you may not know about these radios, but old style radios where you kind of have to kind of go back between channels. And so you're trying to kind of push up the dopamine levels to get them into that green zone. And in ADHD, they're under. So they're under aroused, or they're not focused, or they're hyperactive, but in the sense because the orchestration in the brain isn't working well. So they're kind of all over the place. So you're trying to push up, you're trying to get into that optimal level. And if you go up too high with the medications, you'll get over-aroused. You'll get too many side effects. People can't sleep. They get, the heart rate goes up. It's like too much arousal. And often you kind of have to go up a bit, down a bit, maybe change medication to find the one that fits best to get that green zone. So it's a process of finding the right medication. It's not just take this and that's it. It's trying a small dose, going up, back down, and so forth. And most people, we can get that around that green zone. Some people, every medication we try, even the smallest dose, they get right into the red zone, and then they really have to really depend more on the accommodations and the psychotherapies we have for ADHD. But if you can get, and I didn't include slides today, but if you can get both the effects, if you get the psychotherapy and the medications together, you're going to get the strongest and long-lasting effects that way. So that's the optimal type of treatment when you do that, when you get the medications. I don't think, I'm going to skip this because I think I want to get to question period. This is just a list of medications. I'm not going to get into it. If you guys are interested in lists of medications and getting into the weeds of things, cadra.ca, the organization I'm part of, you can access a lot of their materials, and they have nice medication charts. A lot of doctors use this is taken kind of from that medication chart. So you can go to cadra.ca, caddra.ca, and another resource, good resource site is CADDAC, caddac.ca. Cadra is the more professional site. CADDAC is the more consumers kind of site, but both are good. Cadra would have more information about particular medications. All I want to show you is that there's a whole bunch of different medications available. They have different time release mechanisms, but with Cadra and medical kind of educational programs have ways in which doctors can choose the right medications, like where you start, where you go to, how you go from one medication to the other. Most of the medications we use to start, usually for most people, are the stimulant medications, the ones that kind of push the dopamine levels up and try to tune the dopamine levels with that. There is a problem going to unproven therapy. So the proven therapies are, for kids, it's parenting type therapies, like teaching parents how to work with their kids. It's coaching based on a CBT model. So it's basically, people call it coaching. I prefer to call it CBT for ADHD. So it's using behavioral techniques for people with ADHD. So a lot of symptoms like executive functioning, self-regulation, whatever is going on for that person, and medications. Those are really the only treatments with good, robust findings. People will sometimes say to me, well, I'll do this therapy. It's some balance therapy or wands or neurofeedback or something. It's not a problem. It's going, it doesn't hurt. I really want to say, yeah, it can hurt you actually, because there's financial harm. You could spend that money on something that actually helps. You've wasted time, which I think is actually the worst thing. And it can be psychological harm. So if you're doing a psychotherapy that isn't the right psychotherapy, or any type of therapy, you're going to get discouraged that you've invested, you've done this, and yet you have failed. That's how you'll end up feeling. And people will often come back and say, didn't help, I failed at that therapy. I couldn't do the whatever it worked. So there's actually harm to it. That could lead to depression, lower self-esteem, and so forth. And the wasted time, well, that's really bad. And with kids, especially, even more so. I find often people say, maybe adults, maybe they have some more time to work with. But with kids, people will often say, he's too young for treatment. I want to wait till she's older and so forth. But actually, I didn't get into this talk. All the data we have is the younger you start, the better. So if you want to change longer term outcomes, you got to kind of start young. So that's there. And I don't want to say that, medications have very robust response, but I don't like treating ADHD just with medications. I find if that happens, I do find that the effects just tend to decrease over time. Old habits, the brain has a way of kind of finding its equilibrium, and people have to keep pushing their dosages high. So you really want to think about systems. What's going to support you in a whole bunch of systems. And medications, having your doctor system, your prescriber and your medication is one part of it. Having behavioral therapies like the executive functioning, those are therapies that are really focusing on very kind of like how to kind of get things done if you have ADHD. Different type of psychotherapy. So if you have anxiety or depression, or if maybe people with ADHD have to kind of evaluate some of their past and life, or a lot of people with ADHD have been traumatized. People with ADHD, again, I'm opening up a lot of little avenues here, but people with ADHD have a much higher risk of being traumatized, having PTSD, maybe accidentally putting themselves in situations where they can be in harm and so forth. So people might need psychotherapy for that, getting accommodations at school or work, and by lifestyle, I mean getting sleep, good nutrition, no substance use, and so forth. And the end pretty much does not need to be treated in adults 50 plus. And we started treating more adults because as the population is aging and our cohort is aging. And interestingly enough, you would think that memory clinics would look for ADHD, right? Because memory complaint is one of the main issues in ADHD. But only 20% of memory clinics screen for ADHD. And I'm going to skip this quickly, but people over 50 plus definitely can have ADHD and can be diagnosed with ADHD, even if they've never been diagnosed before. And we're seeing more studies around that. Interestingly, so if you have ADHD, there is some higher risk of developing dementia. And a recent Israeli study actually showed that very well. Israel has actually a lot of research around ADHD because there's only like 3 HMOs, so everything is in one computer data system, so it's very easy for them to pull out data. It's why a lot of the COVID vaccine studies were kind of there too. There is, but interestingly enough, there is some signal, I don't want to say it's definitive, that treatment with the stimulants can reduce, kind of normalize the risk of dementia if you have ADHD. And I won't get into that, you do have to be a little more careful with medications. As you get older, there can be more side effects. I'm going to skip that though. And sometimes we find that we depend more on therapy and coaching with people who are older and have ADHD. We have to be a little more careful in prescribing medications and attend more to the physical part in that. I'm going to do a little plug before I finish. It's a little book our clinic has recently published. We kind of see it more like teens, young adults, although I think older adults may like it too. It's a beautiful book, and it's just a focused, mindful book. It's available on Amazon. Sorry for doing the plug, but I'm here, and we just published it, so I apologize for that. I conceptualized it with our star neuropsychologist, and it's beautiful, and it just has fun and focus. Kind of get yourself into the zone exercises. And a lot of people with ADHD have told us they really enjoy it. Doesn't replace therapy or medications, but it's nice. And I put in a Q&A here. Also a bit of self-promotion. If any of you were always looking for people to work with us, so I bet lots of you here know people, OT, social work, psychologists, physicians. If you're interested in working with us, and we train a lot of people, then you can email me directly. Is my email there long enough? Because I'm going to go to a different page that I was asked to put up, the quotes page. But if you're looking for training opportunity, like if you're a professional, if you're or somebody you know in a regulated college, we would look into that.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Almagor, for your thank you. That was very comprehensive. I think you touched on all the things that we were hoping you would. Thanks for taking the time to be here this evening to help us recognize and find some strategies and treatment around living with ADHD. I know that your advocacy and extensive research in this field has provided many individuals diagnosed with ADHD the tools to overcome some of life's challenges and has helped them choose paths that have led them to well-being and success in their personal and professional lives. Thank you so much. So we're going to move to sort of a relatively shorter Q&A because in the sort of issue of time, we did have some quotes that we were going to put up on the screen coming from some people that shared them with us, from friends and family, just typical comments that people with ADHD, there we are, may say here and there. So maybe that'll give you some ideas in terms of asking some questions. I have a microphone. I will sit down and share questions with Dr. Almagor. David Rosenberg will come around if you have any questions in the audience. Oh, super. And I will head over here and have a seat.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm just wondering if you were talking scientifically that there's a lower dopamine level and some not developed functioning in the brain. So in terms of diagnosis, do you check the level of dopamine, and do you do some kind of MRI or something that would give you that information?
Great question. I think in the future that might be possible. It isn't at this point. So we know that from population studies. So if you take 1,000 brains with ADHD and 1,000 without, and you average the dopamine levels, you'll see the difference. But we don't have the technology to do it on an individual level to know, is that dopamine level low for that person? There are some places in the US that do SPECT scans, but they're actually not valid. So if you see that, if you're ever thinking about the Amen clinics, and you got a lot of publicity from PBS for whatever reason, and he does SPECT scans, but they actually have no one else in the field sees that as being valid. You just can't do it at this point in time. So we have to infer it, and some of it is the art of the interview, of understanding somebody, and using measurement scales as well, but we don't have like a biological marker per se. Some of the biological markers might be knowing that somebody, there's genetic history, something like that. But that isn't quite what you're saying. It'd be great one day if we can. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is related. I wondered if this shows up on PET scans, if ADHD shows up on PET scans.
Again, in population studies, so it's the research is not like one individual per se. It wouldn't show in that person, so you can't do it. So it does show, but it's not a clinical tool. It's a research tool. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you can provide some tools. So, okay, we acknowledge that this person has ADHD, but now we're trying to function as a family, and we can't just say, well, I have ADHD, so. So I don't know if you can explore how we move forward and actually function.
Yeah. I mean, I think saying you have ADHD is great. That's a great first step, and I think that helps too. It's not an excuse, you can't just stay there at that point in time. So if you have it, then it's your responsibility then to get care for it and to address it. So as I said, there's like a bunch of things you can do. And I tend to try to think like the more you can do, the better. And to not look at anything like a magical thing, this'll do it. Right? So, if you address your sleep, that'll help 10%. If your nutrition is better, that'll be 10%. Maybe if you started exercising more, all those things help. Medications will help. Again, they're not going to be not looking for a cure. Medications. I do all medications talks. I didn't get into that. They're not there to have ADHD, don't have ADHD. They don't work 24/7, and they don't get rid of all the symptoms. So if we say, if a medication reduces symptoms by 50%, that's great. And then you got to maybe get some coaching, like learn how to kind of some of the behaviors, like to get organized better, different tools, that type of thing. A good place to start could be Kadak. And they have kind of nice kind of ways of which things you can look at. They also have patient navigators too, and that can also be very helpful. So I think that could be a good place to start. Does that answer your question, or?
So, would making lists be the tangible tool, or is that?
Sure, but I don't want to say to you oh, make a list and that'll be good, right? So making a list might be part of what you do working with the coach, but it's not just the coach saying, make a list. They're going to show, okay, so this week you're going to do that, and probably something isn't going to work, right? They're probably going to come back and say, I forgot. Okay, so that no big deal. Let's see how you can remember. So it's kind of like a process of working with you over time, right? And trying to help you. So I don't find a tip, I don't know you, would work well. You got to work with somebody on those type of things and find out what works for you.
Questions. I'm just going to throw a quick question in just before. I overheard a conversation recently at a dinner party where someone was saying, well, Ritalin is a gateway drug, and if you start taking that, that's going to lead to all kinds of other drugs, et cetera. So please comment on that.
A few comments. First, very few people prescribe Ritalin at all, except as maybe some people still need as a bit of an add-on sometimes. I won't get into that, but it's not our first choice these days. But in general, it's probably saying ADHD medications. So again, it's a myth, and it's a stigmatizing one, right? If you get treated for your disorder, you're actually a drug addict. That's what it's basically saying. So all the data we have is that if you actually get treated for ADHD, it reduces the risk of turning to drugs. Now, to really reduce that risk, I have good news and bad news. You have to start treating kids before the age of 10. So if you really kind of want them to not kind of move in that direction, in that experimentation, all that, you've got to start before age 10. That's when we see that happens. Not that it's too late to treat after, but you may not be able to reduce the risk after that. So if I have a 15-year-old come into the office and, he's using marijuana every day and he thinks it's the best thing in the world, all his friends use it, and he's just completely into it, it's very hard to reach that sometimes, right? It becomes much harder at that point in time. So really you want to start treating early to avoid that, but it's not a gateway. Yeah. So, and again, it's a stigmatizing thing to say. Yeah.
So I know that schools are required to provide accommodations. Are employers required to as well?
So schools are actually not required to provide accommodations. Sorry?
With a diagnosis, I assume.
Not exactly. So most schools are these days. They're required to provide accommodations for learning differences. And in the Ontario School Act, ADHD is not classified as such. So most of them do, but they don't. So sometimes doing a psychoeducational, which looking for learning disability, which 50% of kids with ADHD has, is good for that reason. Because if you have a learning disability, you get formally identified by GDSB and so forth. Private schools can do what they want, but if in the public school system, these days schools will not formally identify kids with ADHD generally. They might still give them accommodations, but not formal kind of IEP and so forth these days. Universities tend to actually be easier. I don't know if they have to, but they do. So just something to know. Does a workplace have to? It's a good question. So CADAC, the organization I mentioned, that's the patient advocacy group, has been in a legal battle with Ontario schools and stuff for a while now around getting accommodations for ADHD. And also they do have tools that can help people get accommodations at work. So it's a gray zone. You probably are, and most employers will give accommodations, but it can be gray zone. How to ask for it, how to address it, I think CADAC is really helpful, can be helpful with that. So caddac.ca. A lot of people are ashamed to get work accommodations. People ask me if they should or not. I can't always, because they're afraid of hostile reactions. And I have seen that sometimes, but generally not. Generally, workplaces are pretty accommodating these days.
Going back to the slide that a lot of people reacted to, is this secondary chemical, not dopamine, the reason why people with ADHD are often more calm in stressful situations, aka good in a crisis?
It might be. I don't know that I can really take that phenomenon and kind of say that's the reason that it's dopamine. I don't know that I can find a direct connection. But people with ADHD, like a lot of emerge physicians, I know, for instance, have ADHD. And they say, I'm great because I have ADHD. I can't do anything in normal life, right? Like I'm always late, I'm this, I'm that, totally disorganized, like friends of mine. But in the emerge, they're super focused, like where I would be like, oh my God, like trauma, this, that. I don't like it. I like being... They're like just super calm, focused. That hyper focus comes in, and they tune everything else out, and they're there. So, but I don't know. I don't know that I can say that's like it's far from the dopamine to that. I'm sure it's related.
Does ADHD have any effect on dementia, or the other way around?
That's a good question. So, is it possible that some forms of dementia? I've heard this kind of theory being put up that maybe some forms of dementia actually show themselves as ADHD early on, right? Rather than ADHD being a risk factor of dementia. So it's a different way of thinking about it. And, in medicine, we often kind of get surprised in those kind of ways. So it's a very interesting idea, but I don't know. It's just it's a theory that's been kind of put up. It's a great question.
I'm going to take that. Oh, we have so many questions we'd like to share and have Dr. Almagor answer, but we have to close. I'm just going to take the podium. So again, thank you to our committee members, Chair Shelley Birnbaum, Doreen Saskin, Sherry Wilson, Lori Morgan-Silver. Thank you, David Rosenberg, and Rabbi Eliza McCarroll, Deanna, Kate, and Pavel for their media, communications, and tech help. And thanks to our committee bakers. Please help yourself afterwards to some treats and drinks. As an expression of our gratitude towards Dr. Almagor, the Luke Sklar Mental Health Initiative will make a donation to Jewish Free Loan Toronto in honor of your talk this evening. JFLT is a historic social service agency that provides direct financial assistance to community members in need. Also, the Temple Library has established a collection of books dedicated to mental health. Our website also has a comprehensive list of resources for those in crisis. We're always planning future events. If there's any topics that you're particularly interested in, please tell us about them. We send out a survey tomorrow with the resources, so you're welcome to respond to that with some suggestions that you might have. Our ability to continue to provide our congregation and the surrounding community with expert speakers and mental health support programs depends on the generous donations and sponsorship of events like this one. Please consider supporting the Luke Sklar Mental Health Initiative through the donations page of Holy Blossom website, maybe in honor or in memory of someone special. That wraps up our evening. Thank you again, everybody, and good night.